Erin and Eric, hi. So estate planning is effectively about taking steps while you're still alive to protect your assets and to make sure that when you die, they are passed on to the next generation. So the obvious starting question when it comes to estate planning would be, how do you make sure that your loved ones are provided for in the event of your death?
Thanks, Sue. So really the starting point in determining whether your loved ones will have sufficiently provided for after your death would be the start of a financial plan. And that really is where you would determine what their income expenditure requirements would be, and then kind of from there calculating what a capital requirement would be to have available for those beneficiaries. The estate planning part of that would then come in to determine what is the most efficient and effective way of transferring that wealth to your beneficiaries to ensure that they benefit in the way in which you planned in your financial plan.
Okay, so obviously it's a highly complex area of financial planning, and there's a lot of tools available to people to ensure that their estates are structured correctly. Erin, can you just maybe give us some insight into the type of tools that are available to assist our clients with their estate planning?
Absolutely. And the first one, probably the most obvious one, is just having a valid will. The formalities for a valid will aren't as stringent as they used to be. What you need to ensure is that the testator signs at the end of the will, and that there are two competent witnesses to witness the will. And while it's not a formal requirement, it is better to have the will dated just to ensure that there aren't any confusion around which is the latest will. Without this, you would then die intestate, and your estate would be wound up and your assets distributed possibly not in accordance with your wishes. Another tool that we use is beneficiary nominations. So just ensuring that if you want to provide, let's say, for some liquidity in the estate and you've taken out life cover, have you got a beneficiary nomination on that life cover? The advantage of having that is that the proceeds would then pay out to your loved one without having to wait for the estate to wind up.
Yeah. So Eric, life annuities, living annuities, how do they fit into your estate plan? What role do they serve?
Yeah, they play a very important role, and it's really needing to determine what your actual requirements would be. So as you know, a life annuity is typically pays on the lifetime of an individual on whose life that annuity is based. And that could be on either a husband and wife or both of them. So it will pay until the last one dies if that is the type of annuity that you selected. Obviously, from an estate planning perspective and trying to transfer wealth to later generations, that's not a really effective tool to use. There, something like a living annuity is a lot better in dealing with those circumstances, because in that event, the investment value that you have left at the time of your death, you are able to leave that to your beneficiaries that you could nominate on that specific investment.
And if I'm correct in understanding that your living annuity falls outside of your estate, so you wouldn't deal with that in terms of your will?
Very much so. So important to remember there, that is the general rule. If, however, you have made certain over-contributions towards your retirement fund, and by over-contributions, I mean contributions that did not qualify for a tax deduction at that point in time, if there are that amount might fall within your estate, but your beneficiaries do have options to mitigate the effect of estate duty.
On the point of retirement annuities, something that we haven't mentioned is the beneficiary nominations on retirement annuities are dealt with differently on your death as opposed to life policies, or living annuities. So if you nominate a beneficiary on your retirement fund, it is dealt with in terms of the Pension Funds Act, and that means that the trustees have a duty to ensure your financial dependents receive the proceeds. And this might not line up with your beneficiary that's nominated on that fund. So if, for example, you nominated your sister, but you have a spouse, your spouse is likely to receive those the funds from your retirement annuity than the nominated sister, for example.
Absolutely. So again, as in the case of living annuities, it doesn't fall within the ambit of your will. So let's get back to the issue of the will where we started. What happens if your will is found to be invalid?
The first thing that would happen is your estate would then be wound up in terms of the Interstate Succession Act. And what this means is that, let's say, for example, you had a spouse and children, the estate would be divided between your spouse and children, and your spouse would receive either the equivalent of a child's share or 250, whichever is the higher. Another important point to consider is that if you have minor children that inherit, their funds will form part of the guardian's fund or will be paid into the guardian's fund, and your spouse would then have to go to the guardian's fund to request additional help for while they're still minors. And when they reach the age of 18, those children then have access to their capital. And a lot of clients feel that their children are not necessarily mature enough to deal with those funds at 18.
Which is not ideal, which is really drives home the point that we're trying to make, which is really important to have an estate plan. So let's start talking about the costs in a deceased estate. There's obviously, most people tend to underestimate the costs that arise in a deceased estate. Erin, maybe you can help start the conversation on those costs that an estate would bear.
For sure. So there are some administrative costs, like your master's fees and your executor's fees. So you'd pay your executor to help distribute the assets in the estate and to ensure the liabilities are settled, and typically that fee is about 3.5% excluding VAT.
And then taxes, obviously that's a big one, Eric. Can you elaborate on the taxes that a deceased estate would face?
Correct, yes. Taxes is normally one of the largest expense in a deceased estate. So you typically would have 3 different types of taxes that you need to take into account. So the most commonly tax that everyone needs to think about is estate duty. So that's a tax that is levied on your estate at the time of your death. And what is included there would be all your assets, excluding assets that's held in a retirement fund. And what happens is that the net value of your estate, whatever that is more than 3.5 million rand, which is commonly referred to as the abatement, that will be taxed at a rate of 20% up to the first 30 million rand net value of your estate, and anything above the 30 million rand would be taxed at a rate of 25%. So that could be a substantial amount of tax that you would need to take into account. Obviously, there's quite a couple of deductions that can be used or exemptions that can be used with estate duty. The major deduction that you can use is everything that's left to a spouse. That would be excluded from the estate duty calculation. So in the event of your will leaving your whole estate to your spouse, there won't be any estate duty to be paid. But when your surviving spouse passes away, estate duty would be paid at that point in time. Important to remember there is that your surviving spouse will then be entitled to an abatement of 7 million rand and not just the 3.5 million rand.
So can I interrupt you there and just ask, in terms of this particular area of financial planning, what is the definition of a spouse?
That's quite an interesting question. So in the past, spouse was traditionally referred to as someone who are married in terms of a civil union. So we all know that someone that got married in a church or in the magistrate's court, he was seen as married. Since the Constitution came in, that definition was expanded. So specifically in terms of the Estate Duty Act, that was expanded to include civil unions, it included same-sex marriages, and it could even include a couple who lived together, as long as the intention of that relationship is to be of a permanent nature. Other than estate duty, other taxes to include in a estate plan, and what you need to take into account is income tax. So income tax still needs to be paid by your estate up until the date of your death in that specific tax year. But then what is also important to remember is that your deceased estate is also then registered as a tax-paying entity, and there might also be some tax liabilities to be paid by the deceased estate. Part of income tax also is capital gains tax, which could be a major impact in the year of your death. So what is stated there is that there's a deemed disposal of all your assets for capital gains tax purposes in the year of your death. So that could obviously result in quite a substantial liability that might be applied to your estate.
So obviously the whole purpose of estate planning is to maximize the inheritance for your beneficiaries, which goes to the question, how do you reduce the costs in your estate?
One of the first things you can do is just look at reducing executors' fees, so ensuring that you have nominated beneficiaries on your life policies. Mm-hmm. This would then mean that your executor is not dealing with a life policy, because if it falls in your estate, they would have to deal with it. So having a nominated beneficiary will help reduce executor fees. A retirement annuity is also a great way of reducing estate duty in your estate, because you're able to then move assets out of your estate into your retirement annuity, either using your annual contribution or over contributing. But then, as Eric mentioned earlier, you just have to be cognizant of the fact that at death, if your beneficiaries take a cash lump sum, the over contribution then could fall in your estate, undoing what the purpose of it was.
Another important method of reducing estate duties and estate costs would be the use of trusts. So trusts can be used in various ways in your estate plan. So in terms of reducing your estate costs, typically an inter vivos trust would be used. So you would set up a trust while you are alive, and you would start transferring what we will call growth assets. So assets which we would expect to grow in value into the future. Transfer those assets into the trust, either by way of a sale or by way of a donation. Once those assets are in the trust, effectively they are outside of your estate. But what you need to keep in mind is that if you did do that by way of a sale, there might be what we will call a loan account in your favor in the trust, and that loan account value still forms part of a value in your estate. A typical way in which people will then further reduce that loan account is by making use of your annual donations tax exemption, which is 100,000 Rand per individual per tax year. So that could be then used to reduce that loan account in your favor.
So effectively, I think a lot of people believe that estate planning is something that they should do closer to the end of their life, whereas in fact, when would you say is the right time for somebody to start undertaking an estate planning exercise?
The right time would be at the time when you're starting to looking at your will and you need to start drafting a will, because that's the point in time in which you need to start determining how you will distribute your assets. And a lot of time, especially where you have growth assets, things like you need to start a business, that is something that is a trigger point at which time you need to think about how do I incorporate this into my estate plan to ensure that my loved ones eventually extract the full value out of that asset as what I would have wanted them to receive.